Alright folks, this is Harris Sultan, and get this, a Muslim prosecutor in the International Criminal Court has sought arrest warrants for Hamas's leadership as well as Israeli leadership. Isn't that freaking amazing? As though what Hamas did and what Israel did in return have some sort of equivalency. They're basically charging Netanyahu with the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, which is an absolute lie. What significance should we give to the International Criminal Court, or even the UN for that matter? We've seen so many statements coming out of the UN that are clearly biased and political in nature. I mean, people are also calling for George W. Bush and Tony Blair to be put in The Hague, but that didn't happen. Why? Is that because the US and the UK are strong Western countries and Israel is always the easiest punching bag? The UN relies heavily on US funding, so isolating or pissing off the US is not really an option. That's the reason why George W. Bush didn't go there, and neither did Tony Blair. What about MBS? No action against him. But Putin, yes, Putin, because the whole Western world stood against Putin in his unjust war in Ukraine, and rightfully so. The whole purpose of the ICC was to stand up to tyrannical regimes, not to democracies. Israel is a democracy, but now they're going after Israel as well. Why? Just to please these Islamist protesters? That's the purpose, and that's why it is a political move. They didn't go after any of the other leaders. They're going after Israel because Israel is the only Jewish state, and anti-Semitism is alive and kicking, not just in the Muslim world.
If the West feels so sorry for the Israeli Zionists, why don't they give a place in Germany? Why don't they go to Hitler's back garden and make an occupation there? Then they will know what kind of people these are. Why every so many hundred years the Zionists get slaughtered? Because Hitler knew how to deal with these people. They probably made a program so they can create a state of Israel in the expense of Palestinian Muslims' blood.
But even in the West, yes, anti-Semitism has made its way back in the West again.
Hitler, he's a G, he's a gangster.
Do I need to remind what happened the last time anti-Semitism was in the West? Okay, let's look at the bigger picture. The world order is based on a balance of power. Democracies, despite their flaws, are fundamentally different from dictatorships. Democracies are accountable to their people. Leaders can be voted out. There is freedom of speech, rule of law, and a system of checks and balances. Dictatorships, on the other hand, are not accountable. They're ruled through fear, censorship, and brutality. Disagree with Putin? See what happened to Prigozhin. Disagree with Kim Jong-un? Ask his uncle what happened to him. And try that with Xi Jinping. Even if you're an ex-president, you will be taken out and never to be seen again. But in democracies, you can say anything you want against Netanyahu. Or Biden, or Rishi Sunak. Nothing will happen to you. That's the key difference between democracies and dictatorships. And what the UN has done, it has created a false equivalence, as though Hamas or a democratically elected leadership of Israel are on the same footing. Now, people are fed up with this hypocrisy and the double standards. They see organizations like the UN and the ICC as tools of political maneuvering rather than impartial bodies of justice. The UN and the ICC were created to stand up to tyrants, not to undermine democracies. When they start targeting democratic leaders like Netanyahu, they undermine their own credibility. They create a false equivalence between democratically elected leaders and terrorists. This not only damages the reputation of these institutions, but also weakens the global fight against real tyrants. So is there any evidence of Benjamin Netanyahu giving any order to starve the people of Gaza? No, there is no evidence of that. Yes, some far-right clowns in Israel have blocked aid going into Gaza, but if a few trucks have been stopped, thousands have gone through as well. Nearly 50,000 tons of humanitarian aid has gone into Gaza just recently. Thousands of trucks go through it every week. And still they say that Israel is using food as a weapon of warfare? Pure and simple anti-Semitism, or just a desire to please these Islamist propagandists because they're the loudest. As they say, squeaky wheel gets the oil. These guys are squeaky wheels. They just keep crying and they keep putting pressure on you. Israel has flooded Gaza with humanitarian aid that Hamas is no longer able to sell it back to people of Gaza.
مساعدة بس بشرط لو بده يبعثوا لنا مساعدة الدول اللي برا بتسمعني بيبعثوا لنا مساعدة بس بأيدي آمنة عشان حالنا بروح لو اقسم لك بالله من الناس مش هتخبز للولد عشان أكله انتوا هيك تبعثوا لنا دعم بس اقسم لكم بالله ما بنشوف اشي إلا ايش بيعطونا ليه لما نذللهم نجري وراهم
وبيضحكوا علينا لما نطلب منهم كمان بيصيروا يضحكوا علينا
بيذلونا
وحسبنا الله عليهم
بيذلونا
حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل فيه.
People die in wars, but the key metric is intent. You have to show the intent that the Israeli Prime Minister or Defense Minister ordered the starvation of civilians. There is no evidence of that. Whereas Hamas has given orders to kill as many people as possible and even bring some back as hostages. Hamas's leadership has committed war crimes, not Netanyahu. There is no country in the world that does more to avoid civilian casualties than Israel. David Petraeus said, no army in the world does more to put civilians out of harm's way than Israel. When was the last time you heard of any military in the world, including the US, that dropped leaflets in enemy territory, sent text messages, and even called them to say, please leave the area, we're going to bomb it, and risked the evasion of its enemy leaders in the process? No army does that. Every army say, well, we got to go after this target, and if in the process we're going to get rid of some 5 or 6 non-enemy combatants, then, well, so be it. We got to achieve our military targets. That's how every military operates, but not Israel. And still, it's the worst army in the world. The UN has become a leftist, elitist, bullshit propaganda organization. What we need to do is to have major Western countries, starting with the US, withdraw their support of the UN. The UN needs to understand that its core purpose was to stand up against tyrants, not democratically elected leaders like Netanyahu. The world is being forced to the right because of these elitist, leftist, Wokistanis and Islamist-pleasing politicians. The UN needs to be reminded of its core purpose. It was created to prevent the horrors of dictatorships, to stand up to the Hitlers and Stalins and Putins of the world, not to undermine democracies. If the UN and the ICC cannot differentiate between a democracy and a dictatorship, then I'm sorry, they've lost their way. How can Hamas and a democratically elected leader be on the same page? This is an abhorrent decision. Let's see whether the judges grant those arrest warrants. They better not grant those arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his defense minister. If they only issue arrest warrants for Hamas leaderships, it will create a false dichotomy and prove the bias. That's the confusion they've created. Now the world is going to say that, well, look, they only issued arrest warrants for Hamas's leadership, therefore they are biased. When the UN should have been telling the world that no, we have different set of standards for democracies and different set of standards for authoritarian theocratic dictators like that of Hamas and Putin. That was the role of the UN, to spread democracy. Hamas gave orders to go and rape and murder innocent civilians and bring some back. Netanyahu didn't give any such orders. If they can prove one order given by Netanyahu or his top leadership to use food as weapon of warfare, or starve children, or to deliberately kill civilians, then I'll raise my hands. Then I would say, okay, you were right. But I know that's not how democracies work. They don't behave that way. There is no equivalence here. The ICC should not treat democratically elected leaders like Netanyahu the same as terrorists like Hamas. This is why we cannot try them together. If the ICC judges do not throw out these charges against Netanyahu and his defense minister, then the US and UK not only should withdraw from the UN, but also actively campaign against the UN in other Western democracies. Because without the US, Europe is finished. They must come down hard and disband the UN if they go ahead with these arrest warrants just to please these Islamists. So in conclusion, we must recognize the difference between authoritarian regimes and democracies. Netanyahu is not comparable to leaders like Putin or Xi Jinping or Haniyeh or Sinwar. The charges against Netanyahu are politically motivated and lack evidence. The West must stand up against this BS And if the ICC wants to become a kangaroo court, then the West must act accordingly. If we don't stop this nonsense now, then will some protesters in London or Malmo decide whether US soldiers can be tried in The Hague? You want to allow these protesters in Malmo or Berlin to decide the fate of US elected politicians and then soldiers? That is a joke. So I hope you liked today's video. If you'd like me to continue making awesome videos like these, then you can support me by becoming my patron by going to patreon.com/HarrisSultan, or you can buy me a coffee on buymeacoffee.com/HarrisSultan. Until next time, ta-da. If you'd like to support my work, you can become my patron by going to patreon.com/HarrisSultan, or you can simply buy me a coffee.